In this video, you're going to continue to learn about promises. We're going to talk about a more advanced way we can structure our promises. This is known as promise chaining. Promise chaining is super useful when we're trying to do two things in a row, both end up being just promise calls. So imagine that we had another function similar to getCountry called getCountriesInRegion. And what we really wanted to do was not just one thing, we wanted to do two things. I wanted to start with the country code to find out what region this country is in. Then, based off of their region, I wanted to get all other countries in that region and print them. That would require us to create two functions with two separate promises, where the data for the first promise needs to be received before we can start the second one. I have to know what region Mexico is in before I can make the second request by region to get all countries that happen to be nearby. Don't worry if that example isn't quite clear just yet. We're actually going to end up building that out pretty soon. What I want to start with, though, is just us messing around with dummy callbacks and dummy promises over inside of promises.js. Now, I actually want to start by modifying the callback example, once again comparing and contrasting the two techniques with how they handle this sort of situation. So right here, we are going to remove our current callback calls, and we're going to make a small change to getData callback. We are going to take in a number, and the goal here is to just multiply that number by 2 if its type of is indeed number. If it's not, we'll call the callback with an error instead. So right here, if, we're going to use type of to check if the type of number is indeed equal to number. If it is, that's great. We're going to call the callback. I'm going to pass in undefined as the first argument, which is where the error lives, and the second argument will be just number times 2. Perfect. Now we can add else on to the if statement. If the type of num is not a number, I will just call the callback with the first argument, number must be provided, or something along those lines. Now let's say that we call getData callback. Right here, I will provide the number, that first argument, and I'm going to start with 2. So 2 times 2 is 4, so we would expect that data would be 4. Now this is okay, but the goal here is to do something twice. So we're actually going to use data and pass it into a new version of getData callback to multiply that too. Now when we want to do this with callbacks, I have to remove the console.log right here, and all I do is I call our function again. So getData callback, passing in the data, and then passing in another callback function where I have error and I have my new data. So if I take 2 and multiply that by 2, I would get 4. If I multiply 4 by 2, I should expect to get 8. Right inside of here, once again, we would add our if statement checking for an error. If there was an error, we would do something with it, like console.log error. And if there wasn't an error and we had a success data value set, we could just log that too. So console.log data. All right, so this is the general structure that we would use if we were to work with callbacks. We can go ahead and save promises.js to see that this actually works. I'm going to cd into the functions directory. From here, that is going to be node promises.js, and when I run the file, we have our little delay. Right here, we have the promise data resolving. Down below, eventually the callback completes. It takes twice as long since we do the same thing twice, but in the end of the day, we do get 8 printing. So this is indeed working as we wanted it to, even if it's not the nicest looking piece of code. So what we're seeing here is commonly called callback hell. And this is just spaghetti code. It's just a hot mess of code. It's hard to follow. It's even harder to maintain. And if we wanted to expand it any further, that would be a pretty challenging task. So the problem with this code is that we are getting deeply nested. We are 1, 2, 3, 4 layers deep for the final code. And this creates code that is just unnecessarily complex to work with and read. So callbacks don't handle this sort of thing well. If I want to do 2 asynchronous things using the data from the first to start the process for the second, callbacks fall short. Now I want to explore the exact same thing with promises, and we're going to see how the end code is a whole lot nicer to work with using promise chaining. Let's go ahead and scroll down to the promises example, and we're going to make the exact same modifications to getData promise. We're going to take in that number. We'll resolve the number times 2 if the type of the number is indeed number. If what gets passed in isn't a number, we will reject with some sort of error message. Right here, I'm going to rename data num. And then just like we did above, what we're going to do is set up a condition checking if it is a number. And I'm going to show you how we could actually do this with the conditional operator. Like we explored before, we start off with our condition type of num equals number. And then we have our conditional operator. We have the question mark. And right here, what we're going to do is call resolve passing in this case, num times 2. After that, we add our colon, and this is where we provide what we want to do if the condition fails. In this case, we're going to call reject with a message like we provided above. The exact message above, number must be provided. Perfect. So now we have our promise set up to do the exact same thing. We still wait 2 seconds, we multiply the number by 2 if it is a number, we reject if it's not a number. Now down below, we're going to try to do the exact same thing we did right here. I'm going to start with 2, and I am going to end up with 8. It's just how things are going to look a little bit different, which is the exciting part. Down below, let's remove the existing usage and start from scratch. Right here, I'm going to call getDataPromise. I'm going to pass in 2, and then right here, I'm going to attach then. What are we going to do? We're going to set up our 2 functions. The first one gets the new data, which would be 4 in this case, and the second function would fire if something goes wrong, if the data passed in was not a number. Right here, we'll set up that function also. We're going to get the error, and we're just going to dump it to the console. Console.log error. Now, what do we want to do inside of the success case? Well, inside of here, I actually want to call getDataPromise again, passing in the data, which would be 4. So here we are taking 2 to get 4, then I'm passing it into getDataPromise again to turn 4 into 8, just like I did above. Only above, I called getDataCallback twice. Below, I call getDataPromise twice. Now from here, there are 2 ways we can structure things. There is the way that's not so great, and then there is the way that we're actually going to explore, and obviously we're going to start with the not so great way to ease us into this transition. Right here, what do? We just add then on. So we add on then, we get access to our data, and then from here we can go ahead and do something with it. This is where we would get access to the value 8. So console.log data. Then we provide a second argument to our new then call. We set up the error handler. Then right here, console.log error. Now let's go ahead and run this program just to prove that it works as expected before we make any modifications to it. Now just to see a different result print right here, I'll use a template string, promise data, colon space. Then I will inject that data right here. Excellent. Now we can save the file. From the terminal, I'm going to rerun things, and we're going to wait the 4 seconds or so. Once things actually do start showing up, we see promise data with the value of 8. So at this point, we have the exact same functionality accomplished with callbacks and down below with promises. And you can see that already, just by using promises, we're getting a slightly better structure. Instead of needing to use if and else to determine if things went right or wrong, we have our separate functions, preventing us from needing to get too nested. Now, this is not to say there's no room for improvement down below. There is. We still have duplicate functions for our error handlers. It'd be nice to only have one function since they're doing the exact same thing, and we are still nesting. We're going to avoid all of that using promise chaining. We're going to explore that down below. I'm going to leave this in place so we can compare and contrast the 2 techniques. So once again, we're going to start off with a call to our promise, getDataPromise. Right here, we're still going to pass in the arguments it might have expected. Let's go ahead and switch up the values. I'm going to pass in 10. 10 times 2 being 20. Now, what are we going to do? We're still going to attach our then callback. And right here, we are going to provide our function. So here we get our data, and then we do something with our data exactly like we did before. Inside of this function, we do still call getDataPromise again. And we are going to pass in the data from the previous promise. So we take 10 and double it, getting 20. Then we take 20 and double it, getting 40. The question is, where do we access 40? How do we attach some code to run when this promise resolves using this new technique? Well, we don't put then at the end because that's exactly what we did up above. Instead, we actually return the promise from our then function. When we return a promise from another promises handler, we create promise chaining. So in this case, we can actually chain another then call on right here to do something when this promise resolves. That's exactly what we're going to do. Right here, .then, and we are going to pass to it the function it expects. We're going to get our data, and we're going to print it. This is where we get access to 40. So console.log data, and hopefully when we run this, we see 40 over in the terminal. Now this is known as promise chaining because we are chaining multiple promise calls together, and we have this chain of thens. We have one then right here. After that then, we have another then call. We can prove that this technique actually works by saving promises and rerunning the script. From the terminal, I'm going to rerun things, and after about 4 seconds, we should see 40 printing somewhere. Right here, we are indeed seeing that value. So what we have down below is similar to what we have up above, but you can see that we've avoided nesting things. Everything is still flat. This function is at the same level as the function up above. They line up perfectly. The nice thing is that we could expand this out to add in a third or fourth promise without adding any complexity. Imagine if we kept adding the technique up above. So I added another promise call right here. We would be indented to about this far before we got to the fourth one. If I wanted to add on a third one, we could do it without any other nesting required. Right here, once again, I just return get data promise, passing in the data. Then down below, I just chain on a third call to then. Right here, I access the data and I do something with it, console.log data. So with very little extra code and code that's no more complex, we're able to add a third promise call into the mix. And this is going to allow us to create complex asynchronous programs without complex asynchronous code. If we run this example, we can wait our 4 seconds. Actually, in this case, it would be 6 seconds. And once we wait these 6 seconds, I should see 80, and that is exactly what we're getting. So with promises and with promise chaining, we can keep our complex asynchronous code super simple. Now what I want to do is talk about error handling, something that we currently do not have. If we pass in a value that's not a string, things are going to go wrong, and the terminal is going to complain, letting us know that we haven't handled our promise rejection. To do this, as you might expect, we're actually going to chain another method call on at the very end. The method we use for this is called catch. The catch method takes a single argument, our error handler. So right here, we would get access to the error itself, and we'd be able to do something with it, like print it to the console. So this is exactly what we would have previously passed as the second argument to then. Though when we work with promise chaining, we can actually use catch to set up a single error handler for all of our promises. So if either of these 3 promises rejected, things would immediately stop and it would move down to catch. So if the first one rejects, in this case it will, it's never actually going to run the code shown here in those other 3 then success handlers because nothing successful happened. Instead, it is going to jump down to catch and just run our error handler function. We can actually prove this by running the file. Over from the terminal, that would be node promises.js. When we run the script, we have to wait those 2 seconds, then we get our message. Number must be provided. So in this particular case, since the first promise was the one that failed, we never actually ran any of the functions in our 3 then method calls. We immediately jumped down to catch, printing the message, which is exactly why we're seeing it up above. So this is promise chaining in a nutshell, and we can see that as we add more promises into the mix, our code really doesn't get any more complex. That was not true up above with our promise example using nesting, and it was definitely not true with our callback example, which required even more nesting and more complexity. So the goal here is not to change what we're doing. In all 3 examples, we're still just trying to do 2 asynchronous actions. The goal here was to better structure things. And with promise chaining, we do indeed get that better structure. This allows us to add complex asynchronous functionality without complex asynchronous code. That's where I'd like to stop for this one. In this video, we got a high-level look at promise chaining, but we've only seen it with our dummy example where we take a number and double it. In the next video, we're going to take a look at how promises and promise chaining are going to allow us to vastly simplify the code we have over in requests.js. I'm super excited to get to that one, so let's go ahead and jump right in.